Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open the heavy door to one of the most bizarre survival tactics in all of medieval Europe, hospitality. You're not just trudging through foggy fields or bedding down in hay piles tonight. No way. You're entering a realm where knocking at the wrong threshold could mean your final supper. And knocking at the right one? Well, that might just keep you breathing. You're a wanderer, dirt caked on your shoes, a traveller's pack strapped to your shoulders, hunger clawing deep in your belly. You've been moving since dawn broke, and the woods behind you swallowed the path an hour back. By this point, even the wolves have gone quiet. But then you spot it. A flicker. A cottage glow. One dwelling alone on the hillside edge. You follow the impulse that every medieval wanderer obeyed. You walk right up and knock. Not once, but 3 times. Not too quick, not too sluggish. There's no buzzer here, only rhythms and significance. The pattern counts, just like a coded knock. To show you're not dangerous, you step back with respect, keeping your palms visible. That's part of the ceremony too. Inside, someone moves. A hinge groans. A wooden panel slides open barely an inch, just enough for one eye to examine your outline in the moonlight. And now, the weird part. If they've got bread, if they've got shelter, if they're not mourning or under plague lockdown, they are legally and morally obligated to let you inside. Actually, in many villages across Europe, especially under feudal tradition and church authority, denying hospitality to a peaceful wanderer was a sin. In some areas, like sections of 13th century France, it was more than a sin. It was a criminal offence. Hospitality wasn't optional. It was an obligation. That might sound reassuring, but don't ease up yet. This wasn't about generosity. This was about equilibrium, a tense, hushed agreement between survival and distrust. As the door groans open, you're not welcomed with warmth. You're met with quiet, the gleam of an oil lamp and a woman's suspicious stare. She doesn't ask who you are, not yet. That comes later if you survive the evaluation. She gestures you inside. No speech, just a motion of her hand. Your body surges with relief, but your brain stays sharp. You've heard tales. Visitors who stepped in and were never spotted again. Hosts who sheltered the wrong kind of wanderer and paid the cost in flames and carnage. You cross the entrance carefully. In that single movement, you've entered not just a dwelling, but an agreement. A delicate arrangement as ancient as the highway itself. The door shuts behind you. No going back now. The interior of the house is heavy with warmth and wood smoke. A low fire snaps in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the walls. The air carries the scent of turnips, damp wool, and something faintly medicinal. Perhaps elderflower. You stand just past the doorway, soaked and unsure, while the woman examines you for a moment longer than feels comfortable. Then, finally, a word. Sit. You lower yourself onto a weathered bench by the wall, near the fire, but not too near, not to the hearth that you observe is hers. Hospitality may demand your presence, but not your ease. Not yet. From the rear room a man appears, older, wide-shouldered, with eyes like stone. He doesn't speak either. He just positions himself beside her, watching you like a hawk studying a crow on its fence rail. Your hands rest openly on your thighs. No reaching, no fidgeting. You've been on the road long enough to understand the protocol. Don't make abrupt movements. Don't probe too much. Don't grin too freely. It takes only a few moments for your presence to settle into the room like fog. The woman vanishes briefly and returns with a bowl of barley soup. No utensil, just a chunk of hard bread placed beside it. You're not encouraged to eat loudly, nor are you offered discussion. You're being observed, not as a visitor, but as a prospect. Alley, criminal, demon in human form. Hospitality in medieval Europe wasn't an open door to joy and feasting. It was a quiet confrontation, wrapped in tradition. The first hour was the most fragile. Some households even had a speak no word to the traveller until he's fed, and warmed, so you might detect if he carries disease, insanity, or misfortune. And then there's that belief, an old superstition from the Welsh borderlands. A man who devours food too hastily conceals a deception beneath his tongue. You tear off the bread cautiously, slowly soaking it into the soup. The woman lifts an eyebrow but remains silent. The man leans against the doorframe, arms folded like a guard. But as odd as all this feels, there's security in it. These traditions unspoken, inherited, half-trusted work. They've kept folks alive for generations, even if nobody quite recalls why. Maybe it's the dread of wrongdoing, maybe it's routine, maybe it's the recollection of one too many strangers who proved to be not quite mortal, or worse, perfectly mortal and perfectly vicious. You glance toward the flames. Above it dangles a carved wooden emblem, a circle with 4 notches. The housemark, some name it. In this territory it's a symbol that the home respects the ancient codes of guest protection. No injury shall befall you while the fire burns. The bread is divided and the roof stands, and you in return must bring no injury to them. You wrap your fingers around the bowl. The soup is thin but warm, the bread stale but genuine. You chew deliberately, aware of every gesture, because tonight your survival depends not on faith but on ceremony. The next thing you observe isn't the heat or the flames, it's the table. It's been emptied, not scrubbed, mind you, just emptied. You can still notice the marks left by old vessels and the flour residue from someone kneading dough earlier that day, but there's something oddly purposeful about the way it's been arranged now. In the centre rests a modest wooden plate. On it, a thick piece of bread, a small mound of salt, and, strangely, a single onion sliced in half. You identify this not from texts or teachings, but from the murmurs of other travellers, the triad of welcome: bread for vitality, salt for honesty, and onion for sorrow. Yours or theirs, depending on how the evening unfolds. In many sections of Europe, especially across the Slavic territories and northern Italy, offering bread and salt to a visitor wasn't just charity. It was an examination, a legal and spiritual presentation. If the visitor accepted, consumed, and remained the night without disaster striking the house, the agreement was confirmed. That visitor was under safeguard, but if the visitor declined or touched the salt with their left palm, that was an indication of bad intention. You reach for the bread, not too rapidly, not too hungrily, just enough to demonstrate you grasp the weight of this instant. You break a piece off and dip it lightly in the salt. No speech, no declarations, only the sound of your own breathing and the soft snap of the fire. The woman nods, barely, but it's a confirmation nonetheless. It's simple to forget, in our realm of courteous dinners and casual conversation, that food once carried sacred significance. In medieval thinking, salt was defence. It preserved flesh, repelled spirits, and even bordered the rims of infant cradles to keep away demons. In some households, salt was positioned at the doorway to identify evil. If a visitor toppled the container, their motives were questionable. You chew deliberately, feeling the crystals sting your mouth. It's coarse, earthen salt, not the refined white particles of wealth. This was collected from the wetlands, boiled down in great iron cauldrons by peasants who were banned from retaining even a grain for themselves. Next, the onion. You pause. It feels unusual to consume raw onion in someone's dwelling. But the woman signals again. The half is yours, the other remains untouched for her. Consume together, shed tears together, they used to proclaim. That way nobody departs with dry vision or concealed weapons. You take a small bite, and the burn rushes straight into your nose. Your eyes dampen. The woman finally sits. She takes her half and consumes. Just one bite. A ceremony, not a meal. and then she grins. Just faintly, but it's enough to transform the atmosphere in the room. The examination is complete. This isn't a banquet. This isn't luxury. This is hospitality by regulation, a barrier drawn in fragments and salt, boundaries passed down from centuries of terror and starvation. It isn't tender, but it functions. And tonight, for you, that is more than sufficient. As the last crystal of salt dissolves on your tongue, something inside the room eases. The fire crackles a bit stronger. The man who had stood stiff by the door adjusts his position and sits still, observing, but no longer piercing. It's subtle, but you sense it. The boundary between outsider and visitor has weakened. You've completed the silent ceremonies, but you haven't been disregarded. They're still observing, just less like you're a predator in the herd and more like you're a stray animal deciding whether to remain or flee. On the windowsill, you spot something peculiar. A tiny bowl with black ash formed into a ring. In the middle, a dried rosemary stem pierced with a pin. Another visitor marker. These were once widespread in eastern France and Hungary. A talisman to identify evil entities. If the rosemary shrivels overnight or the pin oxidizes by sunrise, the visitor must depart immediately. You swallow another bite of bread and ponder. How many shields of protection do these folks require? But you understand the response because you've heard the accounts of wanderers who entered under false appearances and left their hosts plundered or worse, of starving men turned frantic, of lords disguised as paupers surveying homes for attack. In an era without identification or verification, ceremony became the only safeguard. The most intriguing regulation. Salt. If a visitor consumed salt and then injured the host in speech, action or silence, they weren't just regarded as a lawbreaker, they were a violator of holy tradition. In Russia, legends speak of salt covenant breakers, condemned to roam the earth with parched tongues and hollow stomachs, never savouring nourishment again. In Germany, it was thought they'd be refused interment, and in sections of the Balkans, such violators were punished not by the host, but by the earth itself. Harvests would decay, animals would sicken, rain would fall sideways. So every pinch you consume has consequence. It's not flavouring, it's supervision. The salt monitors you long after the folks stop doing so. In some territories, hosts even sprinkled flour or ashes under their doorways before sleep, not for tidiness, but to examine footprints in the morning. If there were two patterns, one entering, none departing, then it meant you were still inside. If only one pattern remained, it meant you'd escaped out or disappeared. It sounds like excessive caution, but this was a realm where doors had no bolts, windows no panes, and neighbours were a day's journey away. The only barrier standing between you and peril was a loaf of bread, a pinch of salt, and the knowledge that violating guest protection was more severe than killing. You finish the bread, clean your fingers on your cloak. The onion remains in your breath, but you don't object. It's a minor cost for being alive, sheltered, and so far unharmed. The woman rises and begins removing the plate. She hums now, just a faint melody, wordless, repetitive, maybe something she acquired from her mother. You don't identify it, but it sounds like the kind of song folks sing when they trust, just for a night, that the stranger at their table won't bring destruction to their home. You're not quite satisfied, but you're not starving anymore either. The strange ritual of bread, salt and onion has settled in your gut like a rock, and not disagreeably. The heat of the fire and the pattern of the woman's humming begin to surround you like a covering. But the silence in the room isn't lazy, it's deliberate. The man rises again and walks to the table. He doesn't sit opposite you. Instead, he positions beside it, facing you directly. Then, without breaking eye contact, he places down a second bowl, not of food, water, clear, cold, motionless. He doesn't speak, but he signals with 2 fingers. You comprehend. Drink. This is a second examination, but different. Not for truthfulness this time, for danger. You lean forward and lift the bowl with both palms, keeping your gaze lowered. The water is pure but metallic, pulled from a well, probably. You sip once, lightly, then place it back down exactly where it was. You've demonstrated respect, but more than that, you've done what they desired. You've demonstrated that you'll comply. This strange choreography of signals, food and stares isn't arbitrary. It's part of a long-standing tradition that turns observation into caution. In medieval dwellings, especially in countryside areas where inns were rare and churches miles distant, the host's responsibility wasn't just to protect you, it was to examine you. And that's where the strangest regulation of all enters. He sits now right opposite you, and he stares. Not impolitely, just carefully. He doesn't blink frequently. He doesn't move. He doesn't consume. He watches. This was typical, especially in the German-speaking territories in the Low Countries, when a wanderer entered at least one member of the household was designated to remain awake and monitor the visitor's conduct during the first hour of rest or during the meal. This person, sometimes labelled the eye guardian, often said nothing at all. Their responsibility was search for indicators of danger, a limp, a tremor, a hesitation to consume, a hand that keeps drifting to the belt, a stare that roams too freely around the room. You realise now that your movements, your stance, even how you held the spoon, everything has been evaluated, not out of malice, but wariness. Because the realm they inhabit doesn't forgive foolish generosity. One wrong move and you'd be quietly requested to depart, or not so quietly. Some hosts had an evaluation spoon, a heavy, clumsy wooden ladle positioned before the visitor instead of a normal eating implement. If the wanderer grumbled, protested, or mishandled it, it was a mark against them. Because a dangerous man desires comfort, a modest man adjusts. And some hosts, particularly in the borderlands, used a trial bowl seasoned heavily with harsh herbs or excessive salt. It was meant to be unpalatable, not because they had nothing superior, but to observe if you'd criticize the provision. The woman brings out a second bowl of soup, identical to the first, and positions it before her husband. He still doesn't consume. He just sits with it. The message is transparent. He won't take a bite until he's certain you're not going to take a swing. And so the staring persists. You chew deliberately, smile never reaching your gaze, and pretend you don't notice. Eventually, the man blinks, just once, and then, as if signalled by some silent internal clock, he picks up his spoon and begins to consume. He doesn't look at you anymore, and that, more than any prayer or handshake, is your signal you're accepted, not trusted, not embraced with open arms, but accepted enough to complete the meal without suspicion hanging over your every movement. This quiet ceremony of being watched while you consume may seem disturbing now, but it was woven into the structure of medieval hospitality. Across much of Northern Europe, households followed a similar sequence. The visitor consumes first, under observation. Only when the visitor begins to consume calmly with no indicators of deception or danger do the hosts participate. It's not just routine, it's a screen, a first filter for madness, sickness or malevolence. You might consider it harsh, cold even. But remember, this is a realm where a single infected visitor could contaminate a household, where a criminal could steal a poor family's entire winter reserve in one night, where rumours of sorcery and poison flowed quicker than water. In some villages, folks believed that a wrongdoer couldn't swallow food in a virtuous home, that the salt would scorch their tongue, that the bread would disintegrate into ash between their teeth. And so they watched, not for violence, but for signs. Even more intriguing were the blessing bowls found in some territories, simple wooden dishes carved with runes or marked with a small iron nail beneath. These weren't for cooking, they were for examining. A host might serve food in such a bowl and wait to observe if it fractured, or if the spoon clattered strangely against it. Bad noise, bad indication. The visitor would be requested to depart. One host, an elderly widow near Mainz, was known for positioning a single hair from her own head in each visitor's bowl. She believed that if the visitor truly intended harm, the hair would twist and float to the surface. Her neighbours considered her strange, but she was never plundered. Tonight your host doesn't use deceptions, just his vision. And now that he's consuming, the atmosphere seems lighter. The woman sits again too, though she consumes in silence. No one has spoken more than 2 words since you arrived, and yet you've had a complete conversation, one spoken entirely in stares, signals, bites and sips, a kind of choreography developed over centuries, not born from generosity, but from necessity. Because in the medieval realm, faith didn't arrive with the knock. It had to be gained with every single chew. The meal concludes without ceremony, no prayer, no second servings. The woman clears the bowls with brisk efficiency, and the man wipes his palms on a cloth that might once have been white. You push back slightly from the table, waiting. Because now comes the second examination. Where will they permit you to sleep? In the medieval realm, where you slept revealed everything about who they thought you were. Nobility had feather mattresses, monks had narrow wooden beds, and wanderers, landed somewhere between honoured visitor and probable criminal. And the clue to where you stood, the floor. The woman picks up a stub of candle and ignites it from the hearth. Then she signals with her chin toward a ladder in the far corner of the room. You blink aloft. That's unexpected. That's generous. You rise and follow her, carefully, keeping your footsteps quiet and your posture straight. You don't want to seem too enthusiastic, but you also don't want to offend her by hesitating. As you reach the summit of the ladder, you step onto a wide wooden platform tucked beneath the roof beams. It's warm up here, a little smoky. The heat from the hearth below has risen and settled like breath under a covering. There's a pile of straw covered with rough woolen cloth, maybe a mattress, maybe just padding. It smells faintly of thyme and sheep. On it sits a folded blanket, coarse and clean, and beside it another shape, another wanderer. You can just make out the curve of a shoulder, the glint of an open eye. They're awake, watching you settle down on the far side, careful not to disturb them. This wasn't unusual. In fact, many households had designated visitor lofts, usually above the main room, where multiple wanderers might share space. The logic was, if someone screams, the whole household will hear. If there's a blade drawn, it won't be silent. And most importantly, strangers don't deserve private chambers. In some households, family members, especially daughters, slept on the floor or in the kitchen, while unknown wanderers were positioned up high, out of reach. Safer for everyone, especially if your intentions weren't honourable. Below you, the fire hisses gently. You can hear the man's boots thud as he removes them. The woman begins murmuring a prayer. Not for you, of course. For the dwelling. You lie down on the straw. It crinkles beneath your back, and the blanket is scratchy against your palms. You shift slightly and wince as a stem jabs your ribs. But you say nothing, because protesting would be an error. Protesting would mean you anticipated more. And here, anticipations are dangerous. Downstairs, the candle is extinguished. Darkness consumes the loft like ink. And now you listen to the breathing beside you, to the groan of beams, to the distant howl of wind outside the shutters. Your vision adjusts. You can make out beams, rafters, a dangling iron hook. The person next to you doesn't move, but their vision is still open, watching the ceiling. Just like you. 2 strangers, half-fed, not quite trusted, lying side by side in the darkness, and still safer than being alone on the road. Time passes slowly in the loft. Sleep hovers just out of reach, as if waiting for one last examination. You lie motionless, listening for sequences, your own breathing. The steady rustle of the blanket beside you, the faint groan of cooling timber down below. The occasional cough reminds you the household is still awake, still aware. At some point, the other wanderer sighs, not loudly, just enough to acknowledge the shared strangeness of this arrangement. There are no introductions, no whispers in the darkness that would break the fragile boundary of civility. You don't know who they are. You don't want to. In this realm, knowledge is hazard. The less you understand, the safer you sleep. This practice of strangers sharing beds or sleeping quarters was not just tolerated, it was anticipated, especially in poorer households where space was precious and privacy a luxury reserved for nobility. In fact, many medieval laws and traditions referred to the visitor not as a single person, but as a category. Those who pass through. And those who pass through don't need beds of their own. They just need a location to not perish in the night. Some towns even codified it. In sections of 14th century Denmark and Scotland, local regulations described how wanderers could be stacked. Yes, stacked in communal barns, lofts or hay storage areas separated by social rank and gender, not comfort. A noble visitor got the far wall, a tradesman the centre, a peddler wherever there was space not already occupied. And then there were the travelling bedrolls or visitor quilts. Heavy woolen mats passed from town to town, each one stitched with a symbol from the last house it stayed in, kind of like a medieval passport, but one that smelled strongly of sheep and old perspiration. You curl tighter beneath your own blanket, grateful not to be lying in a barn tonight. Still, the strangeness creeps in, the awareness that your body is just inches from another's, that the breath you hear isn't yours, that if things went wrong, if the person beside you were frantic or insane, you'd have very little time to react. It wasn't always secure. There were accounts whispered between village mothers and cautious innkeepers of wanderers waking up to find their purse vanished, or worse, their companion vanished, leaving behind only a smear of blood on the floorboards. That's why some hosts positioned a bell beside the loft ladder, attached to a string wound around the visitor's wrist. If the visitor moved too swiftly, the bell rang. If they screamed in the night, the bell would ring louder. No bell here, just faith, or maybe exhaustion. As the darkness deepens, your mind drifts. You think about what this family witnessed when you knocked. Dirt on your shoes, the fray in your cloak, the way you reached for the bread. Did you pass their examination? Or were they just too compassionate to send you back out into the night? Either way, you're here now. The other wanderer finally turns, pulling their blanket closer. The straw rustles, their vision closes. You let yours do the same. And in the shared hush of that strange bed under that strange roof, among strangers following stranger regulations, you fall asleep. Morning arrives not with a rooster's crow, but with the slow groan of footsteps on the floor below. You wake before the candlelight. The room is still shadowed, still hushed. But somewhere downstairs, someone has begun to move. Soft clinks of pottery, the faint rustle of a cloak, the distinct scrape of iron on wood. You don't move just yet. It's an unspoken regulation. Wait for the host to summon. Rising too early, wandering before you're called, even stepping off the loft without permission, it all signals unrest, impatience, or worse, suspicion. Beside you, the other wanderer is already sitting up, their back turned, arms wrapped around their knees. They don't look at you. They're waiting too. Eventually a voice rises from below. It's the woman's, low, and even come down if you're still breathing. You take that as your morning signal. Descending the ladder carefully, you land on the same cold planks you stepped on the night before. But now you're not just a stranger, you're a visitor who didn't burn the house down or slit anyone's throat, which in medieval terms puts you slightly above average. The woman is already stoking the fire, the man gone out to the fields, perhaps, or tending livestock. No farewell, no prayer. In many households, the man's responsibility ended at nightfall. Morning was the woman's domain, feeding, fetching, observing who departed and who lingered too long. She hands you a mug of something hot. Not tea. It smells of boiled barley and a bit of dried mint. A peasant's breakfast. The cup is chipped, but warm. You nod in gratitude, but she doesn't reply. She's watching again, not with suspicion, but with interest. Now, what kind of visitor will you be in daylight? You sit where you did last night, careful to wait before consuming. There's a rhythm here, a ceremony to be followed, and that brings you to another odd regulation. The guest book. No, not a parchment with your name. In some towns, especially near trade roads or close to abbeys, homes kept a verbal record of visitors, who stayed when and what happened after. These weren't just accounts, they were survival instruments. One neighbour might say, "We had a tall man from Bruges once consumed all our lentils and departed with my daughter's ring." Another might add, "Don't trust the merchant with the copper clasp, his horse departed lame." And so did we. These tales passed from house to house like sacred lore. Entire villages developed oral registries, updated in marketplaces or churchyards, designed to caution and remember. In locations with high traffic, this turned into something eerily close to a blacklist. If your name or description was remembered poorly, doors wouldn't open. Next time, you sip slowly. The other wanderer now sits across the room, silent, hunched over their own mug. No words pass between you. You're not companions, you're not allies, you're just witnesses to each other's conduct. The woman finally breaks the silence. "You'll be on your way after this," she says. "It's not a question." You nod. That's another part of the unwritten agreement. You're not anticipated to linger. In fact, you're anticipated to depart quietly, gratefully, and preferably with no trace you were ever here. You finish the last sip of barley brew and place the mug down gently, mindful not to leave a ring on the table. The woman doesn't hurry you, but her vision flicks once toward the door, a small nudge wrapped in politeness. You comprehend. 3 days? That was the regulation. But you've only remained one night, and still the clock is ticking. In medieval hospitality, the 3-day boundary wasn't just tradition, it was ethics. The first night was duty, the second courtesy, the third tolerated. But the fourth, that was offence. Remaining too long turned a visitor into a burden, and a burden into a parasite. This regulation appears across cultures. Latin texts warn against the decay of the fourth dawn. Some Norse proverbs claim that by the third day, even fish and a visitor begin to stink. It's not harsh, it's pragmatic. Resources were limited, faith was fragile, and hosts, no matter how generous, were not infinite wells of charity. You stand, stretch slowly, and gather your things. A worn satchel, a blade wrapped in linen, a strip of dried apple for the road. You turn to thank her, but again she speaks first. "Leave your name if you want," she says, almost as if she doesn't care. You pause. In some households, giving your name was a present or a gamble. Names held authority. If you'd been compassionate, honest, helpful, your name might earn you favour the next time you pass through. But if not, it would follow you like a condemnation. In some villages, the same visitor name was carved into a wall beam or scratched into a doorway. Faint initials, proof that someone survived a night. Here, once you give her a name, not your complete one, just enough. She nods again, already turning back to her tasks. No wave, no grin. That's fine. That's the rhythm. You open the door, and now you meet the last part of the ceremony, the silent send-off. In many sections of medieval Europe, it was considered misfortune for a host to watch a visitor walk away. Some believed it tied the soul to the household, or invited longing, or worse, harsh weather. Instead, the host remained inside, turning their back while the visitor crossed the threshold. No farewell, no backward stare. But there was one exception, the parting present. Not gold or goods, just bread. Always bread. A crust, a slice, sometimes even a biscuit if the house was wealthier than it looked. Given without a word, pressed into your palm or tucked into your satchel. Not a meal, just a message. You are fed, you are not forgotten. Don't return too soon. And sure enough, just as your palm touches the latch, the woman presses something into your hand, a small heel of yesterday's loaf wrapped in cloth, still warm from being close to the fire. You murmur gratitude, but she's already turned away. The door swings shut behind you, and like that, you're no longer a visitor. You're a wanderer again. But now you carry something more than bread. You carry witness to their ceremonies, their regulations, their strange tightrope between compassion and wariness. And for the next weary wanderer who knocks on this door, your conduct tonight might just buy them a bed. The road welcomes you with a chill. Your shoes crunch over frost-laced dirt, and your breath clouds the morning air like smoke from a snuffed candle. You're still holding that loaf, warmth fading against your ribs like something sacred. The cottage has vanished behind you now, swallowed by mist. Just another shape in the trees, another house in a chain of hundreds, each one carrying its own customs, its own silent warnings. But not every threshold offers mercy. Some demand proof of who you are. By the time the next village appears, dawn has broken. The church spire catches your eye first, then the rooftops, all steep angles and wood shingles thick with moss. Just beyond the common well, you see what you need. A roadside alehouse. The wooden sign sways in the wind, hinges groaning. You step through the door expecting warmth, but what you notice first is a sword mounted above the entrance. Not for show, not decoration. A working blade, rust at the hilt, wrapped in cloth, hammered into the beam. Next to it hangs another, broken clean through, streaked with dried crimson that flakes when the door swings. You stop cold because you know exactly what this means. Disarm or stay out. Across much of medieval Europe, especially near trade routes and borderlands, this was the law. No traveller enters armed, and if you tried, that sword overhead was a reminder of what became of the last idiot who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The tavern keeper is easy to spot, a broad woman with thick forearms and eyes that miss nothing. She doesn't welcome you. She looks straight at your waist. You raise your palms, then carefully unhook the dagger at your belt and set it on the table by the door. You loop a length of twine around the handle, a peace bond, and pass it to her. She examines it, then gives a single nod before placing it behind the counter where you can see it but can't reach it. Only after that are you permitted to sit. Peace bonding wasn't limited to weapons. In certain regions, visitors were forced to remove boots, belts, even their outer layers, anything that might hide a blade. It wasn't meant as disrespect, it was about staying alive. The barkeeps, the innkeepers, the alewives, they'd all witnessed it before. A guest drinks too much. Words get heated. Steel flashes and the floors painted red before morning. So the rules weren't written on parchment but carved into memory by bloodshed. Some villages pushed it even further. A house near Ghent supposedly kept a bucket of cold ash by the entrance. Visitors had to dip their hands in the ash and press their palms to the doorframe, proof they weren't carrying powder, poison, or guilt. Others, like this one, relied on public shame to keep order. If someone refused to disarm, they weren't kicked out. They were forced to stay and ridiculed. Stories tell of a Bavarian tavern that kept a chicken feather bonnet on hand. Any man who wouldn't peace bond his weapon had to wear it all evening. A warning to everyone else, and a punishment far worse than violence: humiliation. You sip the thin ale they've served you, aware that no one's sitting close. That's another rule. You eat and drink alone until you're known, until your name or your silence earns you a place at someone's table. For now, your blade's behind the counter and your every move is being studied by a dozen silent, watchful eyes. The tavern fills gradually. Locals wander in smelling of hay and wood smoke still caught in their clothes. No one greets you at first, not even with a glance, but you sense them marking your presence all the same. Everything about you is being read. You keep your shoulders relaxed, but not slack, elbows clear of the table, hands always in view. You don't gulp your drink, even though you're thirsty. And when another guest enters, a red-faced man with a limp, you shift slightly on the bench to make room. Without a word. That's what changes things. He grunts once, not directly at you, but somewhere near you. Then he sits. A signal. Now you're no longer a ghost. That's how it worked in medieval taverns and rest stops. Speech came last. Before anyone learned your name, they studied your stillness. What you drank, what you touched, where your gaze landed. A wandering eye could mark you as a thief, a hard stare as trouble, a bowed head, maybe grief, maybe danger. Either way, best left alone. The man beside you taps his mug on the table twice, then once more. That's not random, it's deliberate. In some towns, especially in the Low Countries, taverns created their own silent languages. Taps, knocks, gestures to avoid speaking entirely. Why? Because dialect shifted, tempers sparked, and everyone was always listening. He slides his mug forward just slightly, toward you, a small offering. You do the same, and your cups touch softly. Now he speaks. You came through Oak Ridge. A test. You didn't, and you won't lie. No, you answer. Came from the hills. He grunts again. Good enough. Then, dropping his voice, he says something you weren't expecting. Made me lace my boots together. You blink. You've heard of this before. In some areas, especially near unstable borders, inns enforced strange customs for newcomers. The bootlacing rule was one. Travellers had to tie their own bootlaces together and wear them around their necks while inside. Awkward, embarrassing, uncomfortable, but effective. Nobody could bolt, nobody could flee after doing something they shouldn't. If you stayed, it meant you intended to stay. Other towns had different approaches. You surrendered one boot to the innkeeper, a guarantee, no boot, no departure. Some places even demanded a token of value, a coin, a weapon, a keepsake, only returned if your stay ended without trouble. The man beside you laughs darkly. Still got straw stuck in my hair from sleeping in that attic. At least they didn't make me bunk with goats this time, and now it clicks. He's just like you, a stranger drifting through, guided not by hospitality or mercy, but by codes. Unspoken, inherited, sometimes absurd, but always enforced. Your blade stays behind the counter. Your boots stay on your feet. Your name hasn't been spoken, but as long as you drink slow, speak plain, and follow whatever strange customs govern this place, you just might survive the night. You sleep in the tavern's corner that night, spine pressed to the wall, knees drawn up. No beds here, just benches, straw, and whatever heat you can trap under your cloak. The barkeep handed you a blanket, thin and stiff from years of use, but didn't ask for payment. Maybe you passed whatever test she keeps in her mind. Still, when you wake before first light, you know you were watched. Because truly, you were. And now it's your turn to show you're not just some drifter who takes and leaves. As dim grey light creeps through the wooden shutters, you rise and start resetting the room. You collect empty mugs, stack wood beside the hearth, even sweep stray crumbs into the ash pail. Nobody asks, nobody thanks you. But someone notices, and that matters. Because across much of medieval Europe, especially in shared lodgings and taverns, there was a curious tradition, the leaving behind of a token guest. It sounds dark, but it was practical. In homes worried about theft, flight, or worse, a traveller might be asked to leave a servant, apprentice, or even a relative behind while they conducted business in town. Like collateral, a living promise he'll return, his nephew's still here. Among wealthier circles, this practice became official. Some noble estates drafted hospitality bonds, where a guest swore to pay if they or their party violated any household rule. But among common people, the hostage custom existed without contracts. You recall a man in the southern valleys once saying, "I let a baker's boy stay in my barn. Come morning the baker was gone, so I kept the boy until spring." He said it so casually as though nobody questioned whether that was fair. But truthfully, these arrangements had layers most didn't see. The hostage was rarely harmed. In fact, mistreating the person left behind was itself a violation. The bond ran both directions. The traveller must come back, and the host must protect what was entrusted. And when no person could be spared, an item took their place. A belt buckle, a knife, a boot. One man famously left his hat, a felt one with a silver pin, and walked out bareheaded in full trust. He came back a week later and the hat was waiting. This morning nobody asks you to leave anything. You're not quite that trusted yet. But you do something small, quietly, as you slip through the door. You place a smooth stone on the threshold. Nothing special, just a river rock washed and dried. Travellers like you know the message. I passed through. I caused no harm. I may return. You step back onto the road, the inn dissolving behind you like smoke, but this time you feel something tug lightly in your chest. A thread, a vow that somewhere, someone remembers your face and didn't bar the door when you left. By midday, the road opens into wide pasture land, and beyond that, stone walls, green fields, and a grey shape rising in the distance. A monastery. You recognise the outline easily. Square bell tower, walled gardens, narrow walkways, and most importantly a guest house tucked off to the side past the herb beds and sheep pens. Because when everything else failed, when no cottage opened and no tavern dared take in a wanderer, the church remained the traveller's final refuge. But sanctuary had its own conditions. You pass under the stone archway, ducking slightly from habit. The gate creaks shut behind you, not forced, just wind. And for a moment, everything stills. No market noise, no hoofbeats, no arguing voices. Just wind through ivy and the distant sound of someone splitting wood. You approach the guest house slowly. The structure is plain, whitewashed stone, wooden lintel, a cross faintly carved above the door. You knock just once, respectfully, and wait. A moment passes, then the door opens. Not wide, just enough for a thin face to appear. A monk, perhaps in his 40s, clean-shaven and pale. His robes are rough, brown, hands hidden in his sleeves. He doesn't speak, just observes you. You bow slightly. No words. That's the custom. Monastic hospitality was regulated, structured, bound by sacred rule. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed in abbeys throughout Europe, commanded monks to welcome all guests as though they were Christ himself. But over time, that ideal grew more complicated. Welcome them, but watch them. Feed them, but keep them separate. Trust, but confirm. The monk steps aside, and you enter. The guest house is simple. Stone floor, one bench, a hearth already cold. A second monk appears carrying a bowl of water and a cloth. He sets it before you. Foot washing, a symbolic act more about humility than cleanliness. You kneel and wash your own feet. That's the custom now. The monks won't do it for you, not until they're certain you're neither noble nor diseased. Once finished, they offer bread and broth, plain but warm. They still haven't spoken because in many monasteries, especially during Lent or Holy Eves, monks observed silence even when receiving visitors. Communication happened through gestures, looks, and small wooden tablets marked with chalk symbols. A bowl for hunger, a cross for prayer, an arrow for keep moving. You eat quietly, the only sound your spoon scraping the bowl. Then comes the unusual moment. The ledger, not of names, but of origins. The older monk sets a thin slate before you, inscribed with a single line of Latin, Unde venis. Where do you come from? You don't write your name, you write Montes Boreales, the northern hills. He nods. That's sufficient. Monasteries kept travel records, not for gossip, but to track the flow of pilgrims, refugees, and occasional criminals. And some logs, it was said, stretched back generations. Visitors who had stolen, lied, or profaned sacred ground were noted, their names whispered abbey to abbey by candlelight. You finish your meal. The monk returns. He points to a mat in the corner near a low window. No bed, just straw, a blanket, and a spot to rest where you remain visible. Because even here, in God's house, a traveller is welcome but not invisible. By the next sunrise you're back on the road with aching feet and a clearer head. The monastery didn't ask you to linger. That was their way. Provide shelter, then guide you onward with quiet smiles and bread wrapped in cloth. Pilgrims are meant to wander, not settle, and so you walk. The land flattens into long stretches of field, then twists again into thick woods. This part of the country sees fewer travellers. The dirt path narrows, hemmed in by brush. No markers, no stones. Just the occasional cart track and old hoof prints. Then, just as hunger starts gnawing again, you spot it. A squat stone tavern at the forest's edge, half sunk into the hill behind it. It's built like a stronghold. Thick walls, sparse windows. A heavy door marked with age. But it's standing, and smoke curls from the chimney. You push the door open. Inside, it's dim and stuffy. The hearth blazes, but the warmth gets swallowed by heavy air thick with sweat, meat, and spilled ale. Half a dozen men sit at low tables, hunched and silent. Nobody looks up. You're used to this. You step inside, hands visible, and nod toward the innkeeper behind the bar. She doesn't nod back. Instead, she points firmly at a sign on the wall. You follow her gesture. It's written in thick, crude lettering. No guest touches the barrel. You pause, then nod again, slower, because you understand. You've heard of places like this, houses with sacred ale. Taverns where the barrel wasn't just storage, it was reputation, livelihood, inheritance. Touch it without permission, and you've touched the house's soul. In parts of medieval England and the Rhineland, this was serious. Ale was taxed, inspected, regulated. A single spoiled cask could cost a family its winter food, and a dishonest hand, one that poured too freely or dipped too deep, that was grounds for punishment. Some towns appointed beer wardens from the local guild, or the bailiff who inspected ale barrels for quality. In these places, taverns posted iron-bound rules beside the bar. No guest pours, no guest stirs, no guest drinks until served. Break the rule and you didn't just offend the innkeeper, you violated a law backed by coin, counsel, and sometimes violence. The innkeeper motions you to a bench. You sit quietly. The other men glance up briefly, then return to their mugs. One scratches his beard, another shifts his boots. You keep your hands folded. Eventually, a wooden mug appears before you. The ale is sour but cold. You nod thanks, not daring to touch the barrel or the pitcher it came from. You sip. The woman behind the bar watches from the corner of her eye, not because she doubts you specifically, but because she's seen what happens when a traveller forgets himself. You remember the tale. A guest in a southern hamlet poured himself ale without asking. They didn't shout, didn't scold. They just stopped serving him food, sat him at a corner table, spoke no words, and when he left, they turned their backs. He died of fever 3 towns over, and nobody would shelter him because his reputation, like spilled ale, had already soaked too deep into the floor. You nurse the ale slowly, holding the mug in both hands, not because it tastes good, it doesn't, but because every sip signals something crucial. You respect the rules. You're not here to cause trouble, just to warm your bones and keep your name unblemished. The innkeeper moves with quiet efficiency. She serves without speaking, refills without meeting anyone's eyes. Each time she approaches the barrel, she touches it with 2 fingers before drawing from it. A blessing, perhaps, or habit. Either way, it tells you something. This place runs on ritual, not logic. There's an empty space behind the counter, a dark alcove half hidden by hanging cloth. You notice nobody leans near it, and when a young man in the corner shifts his stool too close, the barkeep clears her throat sharply. He freezes, scoots back. Everyone notices. You're curious, naturally, but you don't ask, because this too was a feature of medieval hospitality. The forbidden spaces. In many inns and taverns, certain corners, cupboards, or even whole rooms were off-limits to guests. Not for secrecy, but for safety. Sometimes it held valuables. Sometimes it was where the host's children slept. And sometimes it was where records were stored. That's right, guest logs. Not just notes in a book, but ledgers carved on wood, chalked on slates, or whispered from barkeep to apprentice. Names, symbols, even sketches of troublesome travellers. In southern Bohemia, some taverns used red wax beside a guest's name to mark suspicion. Others used a black mark, small, easy to miss, but understood by anyone who mattered. You've never seen your name marked. You hope you never will. A man at the next table catches your glance and lifts his mug slightly. A silent toast. You return the gesture. The tension in your shoulders eases just a bit, because sometimes that's all it takes to be accepted. A night without trouble, a nod without words, a mug raised without demands. Still, as you glance around the room, you see scars, gouges in the wooden beams, a stain that looks disturbingly like old blood. Near the hearth, a sword rack by the door with one blade missing. This isn't a peaceful place. It's a watched place. And yet you're safe for now because you've done exactly what was expected. You waited, you watched, you drank only what was offered. You kept your hands away from the barrel. Not every traveller was so careful. There are stories, naturally. There always are. Like the tale of the man who slipped behind the bar while the innkeeper stepped out, filled his flask from the tap, and walked out, whistling. He was found 3 days later, not dead, but untouchable. No inn would accept him. His flask was tossed into a stream, his name carved into a tree trunk outside the village with the words, "Barrel Thief," etched below. No court passed judgment, no priest spoke a word, but the alehouse had decided, and in medieval life that was justice enough. You take your final sip, nod your thanks, and absolutely do not look back at the barrel as you leave. You don't travel far before night starts pressing down again. The sun vanishes behind thick clouds, and the road turns to mud under your feet. You pass beneath gnarled branches that look like claws, and somewhere distant an owl calls once, then falls silent. There's no village in sight, no cottage light flickering through the trees, but eventually you see it, just barely. A low hut near the tree line, smoke rising weakly from its chimney. No sign, no stone wall, just a single door shut tight and cloth stuffed around the window cracks to keep the wind out. You approach quietly, knock once. There's a pause, then the door creaks open a hand's width. A woman looks out, middle-aged, cautious, wrapped in a shawl. She looks not at your face, but at your feet. And now you recall the candle law. "Are you carrying flame?" she asks. You shake your head. She eyes your satchel. No tinder, no taper. "No," you say softly. Only then does she open the door wider. Because in this region, and in many medieval towns across Europe, fire wasn't just danger. It was the greatest threat to an entire community. One overturned candle, one careless coal, and you could burn a dozen homes to ash by sunrise. So came the rules. No open flame indoors after dark. No guest may carry a taper. No guest may light a fire without permission. And if they did, the punishment wasn't always formal, but it was swift. She lets you in, but gestures quickly toward a bucket by the hearth. Inside lies ash, half-used wax, a candle stub pressed into a turnip for a holder. If you need light after dark, she says, use that and only that. You nod. She watches as you set your pack by the door and sit where she indicates. There's barely any furniture, just a stool, a pile of kindling and a blanket rolled tight in the corner. The ceiling is low enough that you duck instinctively. She returns to her own work, stirring something in a black pot that smells like lentils and old herbs. You sit still and take in your surroundings. On the back wall, scrawled in charcoal, is a list of names. Some are scratched through, some aren't. You don't ask what it means. Instead, you remember another rule whispered often among travellers. If the candle's yours, the fire is yours. If the fire is yours, the damage is yours. In other words, if you light it, you pay for it. That's why so many inns and homes, especially those built of timber and thatch, forbade guests from handling flame. One mistake, one curtain catching fire, and suddenly the next 5 homes down the lane are gone. Worse, the town blames you, and no loaf of bread or polite bow will repair that kind of damage. Some towns had curfews tied to firelight. In parts of France and the Low Countries, couvre-feu, cover the fire, wasn't just a phrase, it was literal law. Bells rang at dusk. Guests were required to extinguish all lights, seal the hearths, and sleep in darkness. The woman places a bowl before you. No words. The soup is hot, the spoon roughly carved. The rules are silent but clear, and somewhere across the room, near the shuttered window, you notice the faint flicker of the candle in the turnip holder. Already half burned, already dying. The candle shrinks with every breath of wind that slips through the gaps in the wall. You eat slowly, careful not to slurp, careful not to spill. In this house, even sound feels like it could ignite. The woman eats across from you, hunched low, one hand always near the hearth, not tending it, just ready. Ready to smother a spark, slap a cloth over a runaway flame, or pull the pot to safety. That's what it meant to host in a world where a single ember could mean ruin. No lamps hang from the beams, no torches line the wall. You've noticed by now the light comes only from the candle, and the fire is fading fast, and as it fades the customs shift too. In homes like this, especially in wooden towns or forest settlements, the night candle was more than light. It was a timer. When it burned out, there were no farewells, no late conversations. The room went silent and everyone slept. And nobody moved after dark. That was the law. This practice, sometimes called the fire curfew, was codified in places like 13th century Bruges, where bells tolled at sundown to remind citizens no flame past the hour. Some towns even issued sealed candle rations, their lengths pre-cut and wax stamped. Guests could burn only what they were given. To ask for more suggested carelessness, to waste it signalled disrespect. Tonight the woman gave you half a candle. That was generous. Your bowl is empty now. You place the spoon inside carefully. She nods once, then rises. With 2 fingers she snuffs the flame, not abruptly but slowly, pressing the wick into the turnip's hollow until smoke curls upward like a thin grey thread. The room descends into quiet darkness. She doesn't speak, just gathers the bowls, tucks them away, and retreats to her own mat near the hearth. You're not told where to sleep, but the blanket has been left by the wall and the straw has already been turned. You take your place carefully, settling without complaint, because the unspoken rule is now in full effect. If you break the silence after lights out, you break the protection. There are stories of guests who tried sneaking from bed after the candle died, who moved in the dark, fumbling for bread, for the hearth, for the door. Some were chased off with brooms. Others were never allowed back. In one tale from the Alpine valleys, a traveller lit a second candle from his own pack. Just a stub, he claimed. By dawn, the rafters were gone. He was found a week later wandering the road, ash in his beard, clutching a burnt coin and whispering about smoke. It doesn't matter if the tale is true. It feels true in the dark. And so you lie still. No spark, no whisper, no movement. Just you, the hush of a house wrapped in sleep, and the memory of fire pressed into the air like a warning. You breathe slowly and finally let your eyes close. Because in this place, night isn't for noise. Night is for surviving until morning. You wake to the sound of breathing, not your own, and not hers. It's slower, heavier, coming from the corner of the room. For a split second, you wonder if the woman let another traveller in after you. But no, you remember the other blanket laid out neatly by the opposite wall. Before you fell asleep, someone was already here. You sit up slowly. The room is still dim, grey with early light. No candles, no fire, just dawn leaking through the cracks. You glance across the floorboards and two eyes meet yours. He's awake too, lying still, watching. Neither of you speaks because both of you understand the custom. Strangers often shared the floor, sometimes the same blanket, sometimes the same bed, and it wasn't strange, it was survival. In medieval Europe, especially during cold months and in colder places, bed sharing among strangers was expected, not romantic, not awkward, simply necessary. Heat was scarce. Rooms were few, and besides, a host could only afford so many sleeping spaces, especially when each guest's stay meant less food, less firewood, less everything. But there was another reason for the practice. Security. When travellers slept close, they couldn't steal from each other without being noticed. When guests shared a bed with a host's family member or another stranger, there was an implied threat. If you try anything, someone is already watching. It was literally a body as alarm system. In some towns it went further. Inns were designed so 3 to 5 travellers might share one mattress, head to foot like stacked logs. You'd face one direction, the next man the opposite, a peasant-style puzzle. Rough and uncomfortable but efficient, and nobody complained. Because if you did, it meant you thought you were better than those around you. You lie back, slowly, careful not to seem startled. The man across the room closes his eyes again, or pretends to. It doesn't matter. You get the message. I won't ask your name, and you won't ask mine. Last winter, you remember sleeping on the dirt floor of a widow's home near Lübeck. 3 strangers, 1 room. The oldest placed his boots between himself and the next man. Not for comfort, but as a silent barrier, a code. I don't trust you, but I won't fight you unless you cross the boots. It worked. This morning no boots stand between you and this man. But there's a blanket folded twice and a small bundle of twine. His pack, probably, between you. A similar message. Respect the line. We both leave safe. The woman stirs behind her curtain. She doesn't say good morning. Nobody does. Words before bread are wasteful. She steps out, wraps a shawl around her shoulders and walks straight to the hearth. She stokes it silently, adding slivers of wood. Nobody helps. Helping before being asked is another breach. Eventually the fire crackles. The smell of oats and something savoury fills the air. Your stomach tightens. The man across from you rolls to his side, back to the wall. And you both wait. Not for food exactly, but for permission to move, because even now in daylight the unspoken law holds firm. You may share the floor, you may even share warmth, but you do not speak until the host speaks first. The woman finally breaks the morning hush with the scrape of a spoon against the pot. Just one long pull across the bottom, thick, deliberate, and loud enough to signal you may rise. Now. You and the other guests stir in unison, unfolding yourselves from your spots like bundled firewood finally released from the stack. He doesn't look at you. You don't look at him. That's part of the bargain. You were neighbours in sleep, but strangers by day. She places 2 bowls on the table. No bread today, just porridge thick with barley and salted herbs. You sit where you're told. The man sits on the opposite end, carefully, quietly. The only thing shared now is heat rising off the food. You eat, but your thoughts wander. You remember stories of travellers waking beside strangers and finding their pouch lighter or their blade missing. But more often, you heard tales of what didn't happen. No theft, no violence, no words spoken at all. Just 2 people breathing in the same darkness, bound by a code older than either of them. Still, things didn't always go smoothly. There was that story from the mountain passes of a merchant who paid a copper penny to share a bed with another man in a crowded lodge. Nothing strange until in the middle of the night the merchant began whispering names. Not his own, not anyone known, just names. The other guest said nothing, lay still. The next morning, the merchant was gone. Nobody saw him leave. But the names were carved into the underside of the bed frame, scratched deep, old and new, layered atop one another like dust on stone. Some said he'd been cursed, others said he was haunted, but most believed the truth. He was simply mad, and nobody shared a bed in that lodge ever again. Back at your table, the meal ends in silence. The woman gathers the bowls without speaking. You stand, sling your pack over your shoulder, and wait by the door. So does the other guest. This part is delicate. Who leaves first? In many households, the order of departure signalled status. The more trusted guest was allowed to leave first, taking the home's blessing with them. The second guest waited, sometimes up to half an hour, so the 2 paths wouldn't cross. One house, one traveller on the road at a time. Too many together looked like a plot. But this woman doesn't follow such rigid rules. She gestures to the door, nodding once. "Go," she says simply, and both of you move. You walk side by side for a time, boots crunching soft mud, neither of you speaking. Eventually the path splits at a standing stone, moss-covered and leaning west. He pauses there, adjusts his pack, and without looking at you murmurs, "Good sleep." You nod once, then he turns and walks away. You don't know his name, you don't know where he came from, but for one night you shared fire, floor, and silence. And somehow, in this strange world of rules and rituals, that was enough. The road bends south, winding through low hills and fallow fields, and for once, the sun stays with you. You pass shepherds who nod but say nothing. You cross a wooden bridge where a child stares from the far bank, not waving, not smiling, just watching like so many others. And you begin to feel it again, that strange sense you've carried for days now, that being a traveller isn't just movement, it's being observed at every step. By noon, you reach another dwelling, larger than most. A manor, perhaps, or a wealthy farmer's holding. The gate stands open though the yard is empty. And hanging from the post, tied with twine and faded by rain, is a symbol you recognise instantly. A salt ring painted in ash on a plank of wood. You freeze because this isn't decoration. It's not even welcome. It's a pledge, a sign that this household has declared itself under the ancient custom of salt and hearth. The law is straightforward, and if a guest receives salt and shares in firelight, they are protected until they depart. No harm may come to them under this roof, and no harm may come from them to the host. It's not just superstition, it's binding. So much so that in some parts of medieval Europe, breaking this custom wasn't just betrayal, it was sacrilege. You approach cautiously. A boy appears at the doorway, then disappears inside. Moments later, a woman emerges. She's tall, with sleeves rolled and an apron damp from water. She sizes you up like a sack of grain, then nods toward the kitchen. Inside, the fire burns steadily. On a low shelf rests a wooden bowl of salt. Coarse, pale, grey, local. She doesn't offer it right away. Instead, she points to a stool. Sit. You obey. This part matters. In homes that observe the salt oath custom, salt wasn't given freely. It had to be earned by silence, stillness, good posture. In some places, you'd be asked to hold your hands, palms up, while they were inspected. If they were clean, dry, unshaking, you passed. If not, the salt stayed in the bowl. Today, the woman simply watches you for a moment. Then she reaches into the bowl, pinches the salt between her fingers and sprinkles it into your hand. Just a few grains, that's it. And the moment it touches your skin, you feel the shift. You're now under the law of salt and hearth. You're no longer just a traveller, you're a protected guest. This law went by many names. Across Salzrecht in the Germanic states, Salers, Feu in parts of France, it was recognised by lords and peasants alike. If a person accepted salt and fire, they became part of the house for better or worse. If they were harmed, vengeance was permitted. If they caused harm, retribution came tenfold in some regions. To break this bond was to curse your lineage for 3 generations. Fields would fail, livestock would miscarry, a child would be born with a twisted foot, and so everyone took it seriously. Even now, as you sit by the hearth, the woman watching, the bowl of salt resting between you like a contract carved in stone, you don't move. You don't speak. Because until bread is served, the pact is not complete, and until then, you're only halfway bound. A moment passes, then another. You sit motionless, the salt still in your palm, warm now from your skin but untouched. That's important. You can't eat the salt yet, not until the fire has been acknowledged and the bread offered. The pact has 3 parts, and rushing them is worse than ignoring them. The woman kneels at the hearth, adds a split log, and waits for the flames to catch. When they do, she steps aside, not out of deference, but out of rhythm. The fire crackles once brightly, and then settles into a low, steady burn. Only now does she bring the bread. It's simple, flat, dark, crusted, torn, rather than sliced. She breaks it in half, places one piece before you, and only then gives a single nod. You eat. And just like that, the rite is sealed. You have taken salt, you have eaten bread. You have done so by the hearth. You are now, by the unwritten law of 100 villages and 10,000 kitchens, under protection. Even if you spat in the stew, even if you insulted her son, even if you turned out to be something darker than a traveller, you would not be touched. Not here, not tonight. This law was so strong, so widely believed, that even soldiers observed it. During wartime, there were tales of enemy scouts who accidentally accepted salt in a home and were allowed to spend the night untouched, only to be escorted out the next morning and pursued. As soon as they crossed the threshold, you glance at the fire, then at the salt bowl. It's been moved slightly closer to the back of the shelf, out of reach, because once the pact is made, there's no need to offer again. It is done. The woman sits across from you now. No wariness in her eyes, no guarded distance. Her shoulders relax, her hands rest openly on her knees. For the first time in days, you feel the room breathe with you. She asks your name, not to write it down, not to test you, but because she's allowed. Now the questions can begin. You tell her a version of the truth. She accepts it with a grunt. The salt oath doesn't demand honesty, only peace. You learn that she's been widowed 3 years, that the boy you saw is hers, that she doesn't usually open the door for travellers. But the mark on your pack caught her eye. She nods at the carving, a twist of rope etched into leather. Monk-made, she says. They don't give those to bandits. You don't correct her, let her think what she wants. The night passes gently, no tension, no tests. You eat more than usual. She offers cheese, and you share a story. Nothing personal, just a tale about a cart stuck in snow and a goat that wouldn't move. She laughs once, sharp and sudden, and then doesn't laugh again. Still, the room feels different now. Before bed, she places a second log on the fire. Not for warmth, for witness. The hearth must remain lit all night. When salt has been shared, to let it die is to let the oath die with it. In some regions, this act was so sacred that hosts took turns waking throughout the night to stoke the flame, whispering prayers over the embers. She won't wake, but she stacked the wood nearby, and the poker is within reach, just in case. You lie down near the hearth, the bread in your belly, the salt now forgotten but still working, still binding, and for the first time in a long while you sleep without watching the door. The morning comes, soft and grey, the way it often does in autumn. You wake to the smell of oats and wood smoke, and for a moment you forget where you are. But then you hear the steady sounds of a spoon scraping a pot and a log being shifted with the toe of a boot, and it all returns. The fire is still burning, which means the oath still holds. You stretch slowly, careful not to seem eager to leave, because in homes that practice the salt and hearth bond, the ending must be as careful as the beginning. To rush out is rude, to linger too long worse. The woman doesn't speak at first. She hands you a bowl, and you eat simple oats with a dash of salt. The same salt she doesn't need to tell you. You recognise the faint grit, the taste of continuity. But as you eat, you notice something strange. She's watching you, not warily, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. And then, unprompted, she asks a question you haven't heard in weeks. Have you ever been served a fool's meal? You pause, spoon halfway to your mouth. You have heard the phrase once in the corner of a tavern, spoken by a man with missing fingers and too many stories. A fool's meal, he said, was something given not to nourish but to test. She nods as if reading your thoughts. My father used to serve them to strangers, she says, sitting down across from you when he wasn't sure of their heart. And now she tells you a story. Not a warning, not an accusation, just a story of how some hosts, particularly in wealthier or more dangerous regions, used food not as welcome, but as a riddle. A bowl too hot, a meat too salted, a cup too bitter. Not poisoned, no. Just strange enough to see how a guest would react. Would they complain? Would they lie? Would they eat anyway, gritting through the discomfort just to be polite? And if they did, what did that say about them? Some innkeepers called it the deceiver's plate. In parts of Burgundy there was even a custom of placing a clove of raw garlic under the crust of a pie, not for flavour, but for reaction. If the guest winced, frowned, or hesitated, they were watched more closely. If they smiled and thanked, the host trusted a little more. And if they didn't touch it at all, that was the worst sign of all. Because to reject food was to reject the host. You finish your oats. They're plain, honest. No tricks here. But her question lingers. You realise something then. Every meal you've eaten since this journey began has carried a second purpose. Every crust of bread, every drop of ale, every spoonful of stew. It's all been more than sustenance. It's been a test. You've passed, maybe. Or maybe you've just played the game well. She rises, nods once and takes your bowl. No other words are exchanged. Because in the strange, quiet laws of medieval hospitality, not every conversation is for answers. Some are just reminders that the rules go deeper than the plate. You shoulder your pack, nod your thanks, and step through the doorway. The woman doesn't follow. She stays by the hearth. As custom dictates, the bond of salt and fire has been fulfilled. You are now simply a traveller again, and the road awaits. But the story of the fool's meal lingers in your mind like a splinter under the skin. You begin to notice things differently. Midday brings another dwelling, less a home and more a roadhouse set where two trade paths cross. Not quite an inn, but open to strangers. There's a stable in back, and a lean-to-shed roof over the entrance. Smoke rises from a chimney, and laughter drifts from inside. That should be a comfort. But then you spot the table near the door, low, square, worn smooth by countless bowls, and at the centre, a pitcher of wine already poured. You hesitate, because you know the tales now, you know the signs. In regions along borderlands or towns plagued by spies and deserters, hosts adopted a curious tactic, the deceiver's cup. Not always poison, usually not, but sometimes soured, sometimes tampered with, and always placed before the guest before the host even speaks. It was said to show who drank blindly, who watched, and who asked questions. You enter slowly. A man sits behind the table, older, smiling, one eye half closed, like he's heard every story 3 times and told them 5. He gestures to the chair across from him. Thirsty traveller. The cup is already full, too full. The wine nearly kisses the rim. Another test. You sit, hands on your knees, and say nothing. You do not touch the cup. The room quiets slightly, just enough for you to notice. This is the kind of test where failing doesn't mean death, but it might mean your name etched into someone's memory. A reckless guest? A greedy one? Or worse, someone who plays the game without understanding the stakes. So you do something else. You lift the cup gently, hold it to the light, and smell it. It's sharp, stronger than expected, either high alcohol or altered. You place it back, untouched. The man across from you smiles wider. Good nose, he says. He drinks it himself, and then he laughs. You'd be surprised how many just down it. You nod slightly, neither proud nor ashamed, just awake, because now you see how deep the game of hospitality runs. You're fed not to be nourished, but observed. You're watched not to be welcomed, but measured. Every cup, every bite, every pause at the doorway. They're not just gestures, they're questions, and you've spent the past dozen days learning how to answer them without ever speaking. Later, when you leave and the road bends once again into forest, you pass a traveller coming the opposite way. Young, fresh-faced, his eyes bright, his stride too fast. He nods at you cheerfully. You don't nod back. Instead, you call over your shoulder gently. Smell the wine before you drink it. He blinks, confused, but the words land, and maybe, just maybe, you've passed the last test of all. To survive the custom and warn the next traveller behind you, you travel alone again, and for a while the road is quiet. No houses, no bells, just the soft squelch of your boots in the damp earth and the distant caw of a raven circling something far off in a field. Your stomach is full, your limbs are tired, and yet you feel oddly alert, as if the rhythm of these last days, the bread, the salt, the glances, has tuned your body to a new kind of awareness. You walk differently now, eyes always scanning, hands never too far from your belt. So when you see smoke on the horizon, you pause, not with fear but calculation. Another dwelling. And as you draw near, you notice something peculiar. The windows are open, the shutters tied back with care. The front door propped just slightly ajar. Inside, a fire burns low in the hearth, and 2 bowls sit waiting on a table. But no one comes to greet you. Still, the signs are clear. You are expected. This is another kind of rule. No questions before supper. It was one of the oldest customs in parts of Ireland, Wales and the Highlands. A law of silence. Upon arrival, feed the guest first, speak after. Some claimed it was about dignity. Others said it was magic. There were even whispered tales that names had power and that to ask too soon could taint the food. So you obey. You step inside, slow and quiet. You bow your head slightly, not to anyone, just to the space, a ritual gesture. Then you sit at the smaller bowl, the one closest to the door. Another rule, the guest eats closest to exit. The host eats with their back to the fire, in case anything needs to be dealt with. Still, no one appears, but you do hear footsteps above, light, unhurried, then the creak of stairs. A woman descends, neither hurried nor hesitant, middle-aged, hair wrapped in a cloth, eyes sharp, but not cold. She says nothing. She sits across from you and begins to eat. You follow. It's lentils today. Hearty, simple, salted just enough. The silence isn't uncomfortable. It's structured, chosen, a space held open for peace. Because this custom didn't just exist in quiet homes, it was observed even in castles, among knights and nobles. The guest, even if unexpected, was served bread, soup, water, not a word spoken. And once the food was gone, then, only then, did the speaking begin. You finish before she does. You set your spoon down carefully, hands folded, still no words. She finishes 2 bites later, looks up. Where do you come from? And just like that, the gate opens. This custom might sound quaint, but in truth it was a shield against betrayal. Hungry people say foolish things. So do liars. So do spies. But when fed, their tongue settles, their eyes soften. And the truth, if it ever comes more easily after a full belly. She listens as you tell her just enough. Hills, fog, turnips, wet boots. She doesn't smile, but she leans back in her chair, satisfied. You look like you needed a bowl, she says. You nod. And only now, with the meal behind you and the words flowing freely, do you realize something rare. This home had waited for you. Not because they knew your name, but because in this strange world of silent codes and careful welcome, that's just what good hosts do. You help clear the bowls without being asked. She doesn't stop you, which means you did the right thing. There's a rhythm to everything here, a dance between guest and host that you've learned not by instruction, but by attention. As she wipes the table with a cloth worn thin at the edges, she speaks again. My mother never asked names until morning. You glance at her, curious. She said, if someone sat at your table and ate your bread, that was enough for one night. Let their story come with the sun. You nod slowly. That matches everything you've seen. Food before facts, bread before biography. It wasn't just her mother's belief, it was a widespread custom, especially in remote or vulnerable communities. Feed first, speak later wasn't just hospitality, it was strategy. If the guest was truly dangerous, speaking before eating might reveal too much. If they were desperate, it might provoke pleading or lies. But if they were fed first, something changed. The urgency softened. The story, when it came, tasted less of panic and more of truth. And sometimes no story was needed at all. In a hamlet you passed 3 winters ago, the rule was so strict that any host who asked a guest's name before supper forfeited the protection of their hearth for a year. That's how serious it was. Some claimed it went back to druidic rites or old taboos about words and food sharing the same breath. You ask the woman if she still holds that rule. She chuckles. No. But I don't ask where they're going either. That's for the road to decide. You like that, because in truth, many travellers didn't know where they were going. They only knew where they had been, and some didn't want to speak of that even after 3 bowls of stew. You sit by the hearth a while longer. She offers you a corner to sleep in. Not a bed, but a padded bench with a wool blanket folded neatly. A candle burns nearby untouched. You nod your thanks. And then, without any announcement or blessing, she leaves, retreats up the stairs. Footsteps light, door closing softly behind her. It feels abrupt, but it isn't. That too is part of the rule. Once the meal is done, the host owes you nothing else. No farewell, no watchful eye from the shadows. The pact has been honoured. Now, it's your turn to leave nothing behind but the echo of polite silence and an empty bowl. Some guests would light the candle before bed, others wouldn't dare. You do not. Instead, you lie down in the dark and stare up at the rafters until your eyes adjust. The bench is firm but clean. The blanket smells faintly of rosemary and clay. Somewhere above you hear her moving, but only just. The house is used to quiet, to listening, and then you understand something you hadn't grasped before. This silence is not emptiness. It's a trust, a space offered without force or expectation, a kind of gentle waiting. You close your eyes. No questions were asked when you arrived. None will be asked when you leave. And that, in this world of tangled laws and layered rituals, might be the rarest hospitality of all. Rain begins before sunrise. You hear it first in your sleep, soft at first, then firmer, tapping the window frame like a patient knock. By the time you're up and lacing your boots, the whole world outside is grey and wet. The host says nothing. She offers a small loaf wrapped in cloth and gestures toward the door. You nod your thanks and step out into the downpour. The road is slick. Mud tugs at your boots with each step. But you've walked through worse, and besides, the bread in your pack is warm, and the fire in your belly hasn't quite gone out yet. Still, after just a few miles, the wet begins to wear you down. You search for shelter, eyes scanning the tree line, hoping for a barn, a byre, even an old shrine with a stone roof. What you find instead is a longhouse, half collapsed at the far end, but still upright on the near side. Smoke curls from the centre hole in the roof. It's inhabited. You approach slowly. There's no door, just a hide curtain pushed slightly aside. You call out. No answer. So you wait. Eventually, a man emerges, barefoot, arms crossed over a rough tunic and eyes narrowed against the rain. He looks you up and down, then points silently to a low stool just inside. You step in. He doesn't speak, doesn't offer food. Instead, he points at your boots. Ah, you understand. The dirty feet rule. In certain regions, particularly among the peat cutters, shepherds and moor folk of the north, a guest had to wash their feet in front of the host before entering fully into the home. It wasn't just about mud, it was about trust. The idea was simple. A person who lies can't wash their feet calmly. A thief won't kneel without fidgeting. A violent man won't bare his soles. You bend without complaint, remove your boots and walk to the flat stone by the hearth. A basin sits beside it, water cold and clear. You kneel, wash slowly, no flinching. The man watches you the entire time. And you know what this is? This is not hygiene, this is interrogation. You once heard of a village where the host placed a silver coin at the bottom of the basin. If the water rippled too quickly or if the guest tried to take it, they were expelled. Another place placed a mirror below it, not to check your appearance, but to catch any twitch in your eyes as you stoop to wash. Today there is no coin, no mirror, but there is a ritual. You finish washing. You dry your feet on the rag provided. Only then does the man nod and motion toward the fire. You've passed another test. In this part of the world, even your feet must speak. You sit by the fire with your legs tucked beneath you, feet still damp, steam rising from your cloak as it dries. The man says nothing. He sits on the opposite side of the hearth, slowly carving a piece of wood into the shape of something that might be a spoon or just a habit. The only sound is the rain hissing against the roof and the occasional pop of wet bark catching flame. There's no food. Not yet. Because here, hospitality doesn't begin with offering. It begins with observation. You've washed. You've entered. Now you wait. In some households, especially those isolated in marshlands or deep woods, the guest was not spoken to for an entire hour, not out of coldness, but as a test to see how they behaved in silence. Would they fidget, touch things, wander the room? Or would they sit as you do now, patient, still, as if to say, I understand your ways, even if I don't know your name? Eventually the man rises and returns with a bowl, flatbread, cold water, a slice of dried root vegetable, tough and sour. It's not a feast, it's a pause. Because even now, you haven't truly been accepted. In these regions, there was often a second right stranger than the foot washing, a ritual so small, so personal, that many travellers never noticed it until it happened. The man points to the rag you use to dry your feet, then to the bowl, then back to you. You blink, confused at first, but then you realise you're being asked to clean the bowl yourself before eating. You pause, then do it. You take the rag, still damp, still bearing the marks of your own road dirt and cold water, and wipe the inside of the wooden bowl clean. Not because it's filthy, but because this is the final proof you're willing to take into your body what your own journey has left behind. You finish, hand him back the cloth. He nods once. Only now does he eat as well. In some places, they called this the echo test, a way of seeing if a guest understood that all things in a home are connected. Your feet to your food, your labour to your right to rest. One guest once scoffed at the rule, threw the rag to the floor and demanded meat. He was shown the door before the fire even cooled, but tonight your quiet actions are enough. You and the man eat without speaking, you share nothing, and yet everything is shared. The fire, the space, the test. Later, when you prepare to sleep in the corner, he hands you a wool wrap without comment. You take it without thanks, because thanks would break the balance, as if his kindness were unusual or your acceptance of it required words. Instead, you settle down, feet finally warm, mind quiet, and as the fire fades, you think about how strange this world is. Where your honesty is measured by how you wash, where your manners are judged by how you hold silence, where even a rag can decide whether you're welcome. And somehow it all makes sense. You leave at first light. The rain has stopped, but the clouds remain, a thick ceiling of grey pressing low over the hills. The air smells clean, scrubbed by the storm. Your boots are heavier now, still wet from yesterday, and your blanket carries the scent of the stranger's fire. But your steps feel lighter because once again you've passed through without leaving a mark. Or maybe that's not quite true. Maybe you've left just enough. A clean bowl, a folded rag, a quiet departure at the right hour. You follow a rutted cart path until it joins with a wider road, and by midday the land flattens. You see the edge of a village ahead, fenced gardens, narrow chimneys, chickens wandering where they please. And that's when you remember you must not stay too long. The 3-day rule. It's not written on stone or posted above doors, but it's there in the glances that linger too long, in the change of tone when a host speaks on the second morning, and in the silence that creeps into the air by the 3rd, 3 days. That was the rhythm in many medieval communities. The law of 3 nights was so deeply ingrained that it shaped everything from meal preparation to sleeping arrangements. The first night was obligation. Everyone deserved 1 night, no questions asked. The second was generosity, a chance to know who you were, to see if you could be trusted. But the third, that was charity. And people didn't like being seen as charitable. You once heard a tale from a lakeside village where a guest overstayed his welcome by half a day. The host said nothing, but the neighbours began placing small items in his path. A half loaf near the door, a walking stick on the bench, a water skin hung from the gate. Hints disguised as gifts, messages without words. When he still didn't leave, they stopped offering meals. Then they moved the firewood pile inside and barred the door at dusk. He left the next morning without a word. That's how it went. In your own travels you've felt that shift, the way a host's eyes narrow slightly on the 3rd morning, how their sentences shorten, how their offer of bread turns to an offer of barley, then water, then nothing. It's not cruelty, it's self-preservation. Because every guest consumes something, food, heat, patience. And in a world where every log must be chopped, every crust baked, every candle trimmed by hand, the burden of 1 extra body can tip the balance. You walk into the village nodding to a man mending a fence. He doesn't nod back, but he doesn't stop you either. You pass a bake house and the scent of rye bread drifts from a stone chimney. your stomach clenches. You locate a spot by the well, unthreatening, visible, yet not too near any doorway. You've mastered the stance of the wanderer who doesn't intend to linger, and if someone extends shelter tonight, you'll accept it. But just for one night. Because the secret to enduring in this realm of unspoken codes and delicate faith isn't merely passing the trials, it's understanding when not to request too much. You don't request food. That's the primary rule in an unfamiliar village, particularly when twilight approaches and nobody recognizes your features. You wait. You allow the gazes to rest on you from behind shutters and between washing lines. You permit the stillness to work in your favor. And eventually it does. An elderly woman beckons to you from a doorstep 2 dwellings down. She doesn't grin, she simply raises her chin toward her fence and says, "If you don't make too much noise sleeping, you can take the bench beside the stove." You nod, rise gradually, and trail her inside. The dwelling is rather tight, but cosy, the atmosphere dense with the aroma of onions and aged wool. She provides you water, then broth, and finally a mat beside the fireplace with a bundled goat skin for a cushion. But before you settle down, she casts you a glance, one that conveys, "Don't make me wish I hadn't done this." You recognize that glance thoroughly. It's the glance of a host balanced on the brink of acceptance. And that's when you sense it again, the clock running in the space, not with noise, not with fire, but with atmosphere. Because the instant you step across a threshold as a visitor, a timer starts. Even if the host remains silent, even if they appear generous, even if they invite you to remain longer, they're observing, calculating how much you consume, how late you rise, whether your steps sound too heavily, whether you adjust your weight while they talk, and particularly whether you understand when to depart. In certain regions, this concept of recognizing when to leave was transformed into subtle acts of social withdrawal. A host might position a sprig of dried plant beside your meal the morning of the 3rd day. Traveller's time, they named it. A courteous signal. In different places they merely ceased refilling your dish. Or worse, they started to mention how difficult the winter had been. That was your indication. One story from a Devonshire settlement tells of a man who remained 4 nights in a blacksmith's dwelling. On the 5th morning, he discovered the breakfast service arranged with nothing but a solitary egg on his dish, and none for the host. He understood the message and the egg. Tonight, as you rest on the mat next to the stove, you consider carefully. If this woman remains quiet by morning, if she provides tea but not bread, if she inquires what your purpose is in town, you'll leave. Not because she's harsh, but because you'd appreciate the entrance to welcome you again someday. The peculiar thing about the 3-day principle isn't that it's real. It's that everyone assumes you already understand it, violate it, and they won't reprimand you. They'll simply ensure no one else welcomes their entrance next time. You shut your eyes to the soft popping of the flames. The heat soaks into your frame. 1 night, perhaps 2 if you're cautious. But on the 3rd, you'll be away before breakfast. You stir before the elderly woman does. The flames have dimmed low, but enough heat remains in the atmosphere to prevent your fingers from going stiff as you gather up the goatskin cushion and organise the blanket with attention. You don't handle anything else. You don't investigate. You don't even extend your limbs, because sometimes the finest way to express gratitude is to exit quietly and without creating a trace. You ease the entrance open gently and slide into the early grey illumination. Another shelter survived the darkness. Another identity, yours left without disgrace. You move through the village with the bearing of someone who's not anticipating another invitation. That's how it ought to be. But just past the final fence marker, you notice it. A bundle of plants tied to a fence that halts you in your path, because you've witnessed that previously. Wormwood and nettle fastened with red cord. A charm, not a welcoming one. You peer back toward the dwelling, but nobody observes. The village remains quiet still. That charm, it wasn't meant for you. It was concerning you. In numerous medieval villages, particularly those influenced by oral tradition and ancient pagan recollection, hosts defended their dwellings not merely with entrances but with incantations, not hexes precisely, safeguards, quiet little actions intended to repel negative energy, illness or misfortune brought by wanderers. You've witnessed variations of it previously. A dark stone positioned beneath a visitor's seat, a container of salt scattered by chance near the entryway, a few kernels of barley placed into the edge of your blanket. They weren't penalties, they were protections. Because just as you travelled from dwelling to dwelling attempting not to create a mark, some believed you transported marks with you. Not apparent, not material, but forces, sentiments, remnants of sorrow, troubled dreams. And so they defended their dwellings with the implements they possessed: plants, stones, salt, vapour. There was a story you once received in a harbour town of a sailor who accessed a dwelling after a tempest. He spoke minimally, consumed slowly, remained only 2 days. But on the morning he departed, the host scattered ash behind him and suspended a dried fish bladder above the entrance. When questioned why, he merely stated he arrived dry after the ocean had submerged everyone else. That was sufficient. Today, you don't understand what mark you created, but the plants are present and they signify one thing distinctly. You're not hexed, but you're not impartial either. That's the peculiar contradiction of medieval hospitality. A visitor could be received with welcoming arms, nourished, provided warmth and rest, and still be quietly protected against. Because to be a host was to navigate a narrow line between charity and defence, and to be a visitor. To be a visitor was to bear weight wherever you moved. Some families created nothing behind after you departed. Not a broom shifted, not a phrase uttered. Others incinerated the rushes and arranged new ones, not in frustration, in precaution, because your attendance, regardless how quiet, modified something. And the prudent host never disregarded a change in the breeze. You continue travelling. The village drops behind you like a page flipped too swiftly, still apparent in the corner of your vision, but disappearing rapidly. The breeze strengthens again, and with it the aroma of damp thatch and something botanical. Remnants of that red-corded charm, possibly, or just your thoughts still turning. But you've discovered not to dismiss these things, because even if you don't accept the influence of nettles and wormwood, they do, and acceptance influences conduct far more than reality in these territories. You pass a shepherd youth who doesn't acknowledge you. His sheep move across the soggy field without alarm, but he grips a small pouch at his torso and observes you intently. You nod, maintain movement, maintain not too rapid, not too gradual. And that's when it occurs to you. The principles of hospitality don't conclude at the entrance. They pursue you. There's a pattern to it all, a dance of observing and being observed. Even after the nourishment is consumed, even after the mat is gathered, the movement persists. You're still under assessment, invisible but not overlooked, because hospitality in its medieval meaning was never strictly about generosity. It was about controlling peril. Wanderers brought information, certainly. They also brought narratives, diseases, unfamiliar deities, unusual practices. Every host assumed a gamble when they welcomed their entrance, and so every visitor had to navigate a tightrope of conduct to maintain that gamble from shifting into rejection. One error and a visitor could transform from welcomed soul into stranger peril overnight. There's a narrative from the forests of Bohemia where a visitor overstayed and mentioned too openly about visions. Visions of flames, visions of creatures walking backward, visions of a tempest with no thunder. The villagers attended, then they relocated their children to the distant barn for 3 nights after he departed. Because visions like that indicated omens, and omens indicated catastrophe. Even visions could contaminate the surfaces you rested near. That's why you comprehend even the most cautious wanderer creates footprints on more than merely the pathway. Your phrases remain, your quietness resonates. The manner you consume, the manner you organise a blanket, the manner you refuse a second dish. These become information, not for you, but for those who hosted you. And certain hosts, they're recognised to discuss with neighbours after you depart. That's why certain wanderers, particularly in northern villages, adopted leaving presents behind. Not coins, that was too commercial, but something more refined. A spoon shaped from ashwood, a solitary beeswax candle, a pair of sewn socks placed on the bench with no message. They weren't payments. They were symbols, not of appreciation but of harmony. A method to communicate. I was present. I consumed your nourishment. I sat by your flames, and I departed. No damage tonight, as you locate a level section of grass beneath a hawthorn tree and arrange down to rest without knocking on any more entrances. You store that concept away. Perhaps you'll shape a spoon tomorrow. Place it in the next dwelling that nourishes you. Not because you're obligated to them, but because in a realm governed by invisible codes, sometimes the smallest action defends your future more than a blade ever could. You'll enter again, barefoot currently, not by selection. The left shoe disintegrated 2 villages past, and the right one pursued just this morning, drawn into a section of mud that never returned it. You expressed frustration, naturally, quietly, but you maintained movement because wanderers protest less than residents. It's merely another unwritten principle. The trail beneath your feet transitions from soil to crushed rock, a positive indication. Routes like this typically mean a junction nearby, a ford, a toll entrance, or, if you're fortunate, a bridge. And wherever individuals decelerate, there are possibilities. Certain enough, a low stone structure emerges on the skyline, a bit too angular, too deliberately positioned. There's a marker above the threshold. Not that you can interpret it, but the aroma informs you adequately. Harsh ale, moist wool, heated fat. It's a hospice. Not the variety for the expiring. The medieval designation means something distinct here. A wanderer's dwelling, typically constructed by the church or regional lord, intended to accommodate the weary and devoted, and if you're fortunate, nourish them too. You advance slowly, cautious not to appear enthusiastic. A small collection of figures clusters near the entrance. A woman caring for a child, an older man with a wooden limb, a friar with a swollen face. Nobody meets your gaze. That's typical. Nobody desires to divide the loaf with someone who might consume more than their portion. You assume your position on the boundary of the collection. A long interval, then the entrance opens. Out emerges a man in a woolen robe, iron keys at his waist, and an expression that communicates he's witnessed better visitors. "We've space for 5, he mutters. "Nourishment for 4. "Announce." "Currently." You don't. You elevate your hand instead. He grimaces, but permits you in. It's not compassion, it's documentation. Some of these hospices demanded visitors to inscribe their identity or mark an X. So if something disappeared, there'd be someone to accuse. Inside, it's simple. One lengthy surface, a smoking fireplace, 2 benches already filled by silent, chewing figures. Nobody speaks above a murmur. This is a location of principles. Hospices like this were financed by guilds, parishes, or wealthy benefactors who accepted that assisting wanderers earned spiritual value. But charity arrived with stipulations. No conflict, no deception, no wine, and definitely no women past twilight. If you remained too extended, they'd accompany you out. If you contacted another's pack, you'd be prohibited from every hospice on this route. You've received narratives of a man who appropriated a cloak from a fellow visitor. The subsequent night, in a hospice 3 towns distant, he discovered his dinner dish already inverted and his identity already recognised. Hospitality arrived with extended recollection. You consume in quietness. Barley stew, a fragment of rye water provided in a fractured wooden cup. Not abundant, but it tastes superior than anything you've appropriated. You don't request additional. Instead, you attend to the cough of the friar, to the whisper of the breeze against the shutters, To the manner the steward tallies the spoons twice. Because in locations like this, you're not a visitor. You're a permitted attendance, and you're appreciative. The principles of the hospice don't conclude with supper. As the illumination diminishes, the steward arranges down a dense, leather-bound ledger beside the flames. One by one, you and the others are summoned to it. Not to inscribe naturally, unless you're among the uncommon few who can write your identity, but to create a mark, a symbol, a scrawl. Yours is a rough X, partially diminished from the final location that required you do this. It's not merely bureaucracy, it's a commitment, a guarantee that you moved through, conducted, and can be recalled if something disappears later. Medieval hospitality in these locations arrived with documentation of a variety. You're directed to the rear of the space, where pallets are arranged out in 2 orderly rows on straw mats. The flames won't endure the darkness, you understand that already. Hospices often allocate firewood strictly, particularly if financed by religious orders. Heat was a present, not a certainty. You recline down beside a man with a wrapped foot who's already producing sounds. The friar mutters something that might be Latin or might be meaningless. A woman across the space hums to herself as she contacts the boundary of her blanket again and again, as if verifying that it's still actual. Nobody speaks because the quietness is consecrated here. Hospices were holy locations, technically, even if the holiness had more to accomplish with obligation than faith. Some were connected to monasteries, others were independent, operated by lay brothers or even regional women sworn to quietness, and some weren't as compassionate as they appeared. You recall one story passed between wanderers, a hospice on the southern route where the steward distributed sleeping preparations to visitors with too many coins on their belts. They never stirred, their packs never departed. It was merely a narrative, probably, but tonight you rest with your sack beneath your head, just in situation. Still, there's something reassuring in the procedure. The repetition, the awareness that you're portion of a system older than yourself. These dwellings dotted the trade routes, pilgrim trails, and war-damaged routes of medieval Europe, like celestial bodies, each one pursuing the same unspoken regulation. If you're quiet, if you're clean, if you don't deceive or conflict or assume what isn't provided, you'll consume, you'll rest, you'll exist to travel another day. And if you violate the regulation, well, there was a hospice east of the waterway that used to suspend markers outside after a theft. Wooden plaques shaped with crude representations. A appropriated shoe, a bitten hand, a fractured dish, a caution to the subsequent stranger who travelled. We recall tonight. There's no marker on the surface, and your feet are clean as you shut your eyes. The aged friar finally ceases muttering. The woman has dropped silent. Only the flames crackle softly, expelling its final heat into the darkness. You've moved through another entryway, and tomorrow, with fortune, you'll move through another. Because in the medieval realm, endurance often descended to one thing, understanding when to communicate and when to merely rest. You emerge before the sun understands, not because anyone stirred you, but because the hospice has its pattern and you've discovered to pursue it. The flame's gone frigid, the steward's not yet moving, and the friar beside you is already absent, his blanket organised with eerie accuracy. There's no breakfast. That's not portion of the arrangement. In numerous hospices you received supper, a location to rest, and a quiet withdrawal before dawn. Remaining was disapproved upon, requesting for more perilous. You slide out silently, the entrance protesting in objection, and locate the realm still dim and blue, vapour hovering low along the trail. That's when you notice it. A figure not distant off, enclosed in grey wool, bent over a staff, moving slowly but certainly along the route ahead. Another wanderer. You pause, then pursue. In the medieval realm, travelling solitary was gamble. Travelling with strangers was gamble. Everything was gamble. But gamble distributed could be gamble reduced. And more significantly, a travelling companion might signify a distributed meal later or at minimum directions. You advance without speaking. The figure is aged, her back twisted slightly to the left, her hair braided beneath a linen covering, her feet enclosed in worn leather strips. She peers sideways and provides you a nod. Not amiable, not aggressive, merely a nod. It's authorization. You travel in quietness. The vapour spirals around your boots as the route curves through marshy lowland. Every few movements, the aged woman taps her staff 3 times. 1, 2, interval, 3. A pattern, possibly for equilibrium, possibly for something else. Finally, she communicates. You're directing toward the waystone. You blink. You don't understand what that is. She laughs. Fresh then. Never concern. You'll witness. And merely like that, the principles shift again, because in this portion of the countryside, hospitality assumes another form. Not in fireplaces and pallets, but in stones. You've received whispers, boulders along the route, shaped with unusual marks. Not religious, not Roman, not written. Merely symbols. Some state they were communications, others stated they were defence. A few accept they were the locations you could rest if nobody assumed you in. No entrance, the woman states, but still a variety of reception. Certain enough, an hour later, you witness it. A squat stone beside a willow tree, levelled on summit, smoothed by breeze or hands or both. Someone scratched a symbol into it, a triangle above a circle. You don't inquire what it signifies. You merely observe as the woman bends down, creates a few dried berries at its foundation, and travels on. You accomplish the same, because currently your portion of it, a wanderer's hospitality network without a shelter, older than the hospices, older than the friars, older, possibly, than language. Sometimes the safest location isn't inside a structure, it's at a stone you identify. The route curves uphill currently, through open fields where frost still adheres to the grass and the breath from your nose spirals like vapour. The aged woman is ahead, staff tapping a steady pattern once more. You attempt not to gaze at her feet, enclosed not in shoes, but layers of linen, leather and cord. A variety of boot, you comprehend. One that could be unwrapped, restored or incinerated if disease occurred. She travels as if she's accomplished this 1,000 times. Eventually she halts without rotating. There's a hedge ahead, she states, dense, with a hole in the centre. Don't move through until you've verified the tree. You grimace, but pursue. The hedge is merely where she stated it would be, concentrated and tangled, fractured only by a narrow trail, and past it a squat tree, almost dark with age, its trunk emptied out like a bowl. Inside it, a strip of fabric tied 3 times. You peer at the woman. She's observing. Shepherd's regulation, she states softly. 3 knots signifies safe, 1 knot signifies peril, 2. 2 signifies inquire no questions. You don't untie it, merely nod and move through. Because in locations where inns are scarce and where the route is lengthy, hospitality transforms. It becomes language without communication. Symbols, knots, shapings, marks created behind for those clever or desperate enough to interpret them. You move a stone surface further along, with chalk lines slashed across it, 5 in a row, intersected through by a 6th. You've witnessed that previously. Remained here, she states. 6 of us. In the depression behind you, peer. It's shallow, arid and barely adequate to accommodate a body, but still a principle, a mark, a history. She positions down there, extracting bread from her satchel. Only equitable to divide, she provides. You pause, but position too. This is route hospitality currently. There are no hosts, no flames, no ledgers, merely a regulation of reciprocity passed between feet and fences, boots and bark, gazes and earth. You distribute your dried apple. She nods in acceptance. You understand, she states, chewing slowly. Some state these indicators arrived from the aged pilgrims created behind by those who couldn't travel anymore, so others might understand where it's secure. You nod, though portion of you suspects it extends even further back, before pilgrims, before roots. There's an influence in passing along compassion and regulation. As the sun emerges higher, she collects her things. Subsequent way. Stones near the curve, she states, triangle, and an X. If you witness a spiral, maintain travelling. Oh, you commit it to recollection. Then she's off again, staff, tapping. And you comprehend something. Quietly. Wonderful. You may never witness her again, but you'll still travel in her footprints. Because hospitality in its oldest form was never genuinely about structures or bread. It was about creating an indicator behind so the subsequent wanderer wouldn't sense quite so solitary. The subsequent village isn't much more than a curve in the route and a drooping roof line. You locate vapour from one chimney, a tethered mule, and a youth pursuing chickens with more delight than purpose. But your gazes go straight to the entrance thresholds, because by currently you've discovered to interpret the indicators scratched into the wooden frame of a cottage near the well. A six-pointed celestial body with a vertical line through the centre. On the shutters, a faint circle within a square. These aren't religious marks, not repelling incantations. They're communications for strangers. One signifies bread if you inquire nicely. The other signifies frigid, reception, but not perilous. This is what you've discovered. Hospitality in the medieval countryside relied on indicators, not phrases. On actions, habits, and quiet. Traditions passed down without parchment. You knock. An interval, then the entrance protests open, revealing an older woman in a patched wimple, her hand still flower-scattered. She gazes you up and down, not harshly. "Parched?" she inquires. You nod. She motions to the side of the dwelling. A bench, a container, a ladle. That's the provision. Water, possibly a fragment of bread, but no access. Not today, not without understanding your identity, your origin, your intent. And that's equitable. In a realm without passports or documents, hospitality had to be cautious. Inside her entryway, you observe a split bridge, branch nailed above the threshold, forked to the left. It's an aged signal. No space tonight. You position anyway, appreciative for shade and an instant to rest. She brings out a fragment and a spread of cheese. "Create the ladle on the peg," she states, "and don't permit the chickens pursue you down the route." You almost laugh, but you don't. Because this is not harshness. It's merely the principal book, a rural regulation that provided assistance in degrees. Water before nourishment. Nourishment before accommodation. Accommodation only if the indicators aligned. She doesn't inquire your identity. You don't provide it. Identities tie you to narratives, obligations and difficulty. Out here it's adequate that you move through gently, that you don't create a disorder, that you nod appreciation and intend it, and that you understand when to move on. Because one movement too bold, one question too sharp, and the subsequent dwelling might not provide even water. You complete the fragment slowly, observing the chicken's movement through the dust. You emerge from the bench, brush the fragments from your lap, and create the ladle precisely where she instructed you, on the peg handle, facing outward, the manner you witnessed the final wanderer accomplish that small action. It's portion of the ceremony, not for cleanliness necessarily, but for continuity, for respect, a signal that you've performed your portion in the unspoken arrangement. Assume minimal create. Harmony. Down the lane, the youth who pursued chickens earlier currently positions on a stump, threading cord through a loop of wood. He doesn't communicate, but you nod as you move, and he nods back. That's the third time today someone has communicated without phrases. You begin to comprehend the influence of quietness on the route, It isn't avoidance, it's respect for the delicate confidence between stranger and host. By the time you access the subsequent clearing, the sun is inclining westward, gold and soft. A small chapel rests at the boundary of the trees, not grand but thoroughly cared for. Its wooden porch is swept, its entrance painted with ochre, its bell quiet. You don't anticipate it to be open, but it is. Inside, the atmosphere smells of wax and aged linen. A votive burns gently to the left. Someone's created a small container, coarse bread, one onion and organised fabric. No indicator states assume this, but there's a smooth stone resting beside it. Shaped into it, a downward arrow and a circle. You recall that from the aged woman that signifies secure to assume. You pocket the onion, fracture the bread in partial, and replace the stone carefully. Outside, you arrange onto a low stone surface, limbs extended, onion cradled like treasure, because even the smallest provision, a fragment, a corner, a signal shaped into wood, can be adequate to remind you you're not solitary. This was the secret of medieval hospitality. It accomplished. It didn't always resemble generosity. Sometimes it resembled endurance. One pebble passed down the route, one knot in a branch, one fractured loaf created behind in a location of quiet. The present wasn't the nourishment, it was the communication. You are witnessed, you are human, you are still portion of the route. The final stretch of your journey operates alongside a waterway, a slow-moving silver ribbon slicing through soggy banks and reeds that murmur as you move. Your limbs ache, your feet are blistered, but you've discovered adequate currently not to concentrate on discomfort. You observe instead for indicators. A strip of fabric tied to a sapling, 3 stones stacked near a trail fork, a emptied log that smells faintly of salt pork. Each one is a wordless reception, and each informs you the same thing. Someone travelled here before you. Someone considered of the subsequent soul who'd arrive limping down this route, gazes heavy, pockets empty. That's when you access it, the final halt. Or possibly merely your final for today, a roadside visitor dwelling, though it would barely earn that identity in the city, merely a lengthy timber hall with shutters fastened tight and a wooden beam marking the access. But a ring of carts surrounds it, creatures tethered, vapour emerging from a cauldron arranged over open flames. You interval at the boundary of the circle because you recall currently this variety of location arrives with principles. You must wait to be invited, and certain enough after an instant someone observes up from the flames. A short, broad man with flour-scattered sleeves and a cloak pinned with what resembles a soup ladle. He waves you in. You advance slowly, maintaining your hands apparent, your bearing modest. It's not alarm, it's respect. These are experienced wanderers, pilgrims, drovers, messengers, possibly even smugglers. But here titles signify minimal. Only one thing matters. Can you pursue the principles? He hands you a dish, barley gruel with a chunk of turnip, and points to a location near the flames. Consume, don't communicate until you're inquired. You nod, position, and begin. The gruel is heated and smoky, the turnip fibrous, but reception. Around you, conversation hums, low voices emerging and dropping in languages you partially comprehend. Someone's restoring boots. Another trims a child's hair with a blade no sharper than a spoon, and on the central beam of the accommodation you locate it. Dozens of incinerate marks, like brands, each one distinct. You squint and comprehend what they visitor marks. Each wanderer who remained here previously shaped or incinerated a symbol, some personal, some universal, some cryptic, a secret archive scrawled in soot. You complete your meal and trace one mark with your thumb, a small spiral enclosed in 3 dots. Create one if you're remaining the darkness, the man with the ladle states. You observe at the surface, and suddenly it matters more than you anticipated to be tallied among the others. to create proof that you moved through, abided by the practices, and honoured the silent agreement of medieval hospitality. Darkness presses in like a velvet curtain, dense and soundless, fractured only by the hiss of the flames and the occasional low whisper from someone shifting beneath their blanket. You recline on a bed of straw tucked in the distant corner of the hall, enclosed in your own cloak and someone else's compassion. The atmosphere smells of vapour and wool and feet, but you don't concern. You've rested in worse. Someone produces sounds softly nearby. A dog whose owner never introduced him has spiralled up at your feet, radiating heat like a breathing hearthstone. And up on the beam above you, merely before the firelight diminishes, you witness the spiral with the 3 dots again. You hadn't created a mark yet, not properly. So quietly, you access for a stub of charcoal from the boundary of the fireplace. You press your palm to the beam, sketch a rough arc, then a notch beneath it, your own indicator not to boast, not to be recalled, merely to communicate, I was here. I pursued the principles. I moved in harmony. Because this whole journey you comprehend, wasn't merely about bread or shelters or warming your toes by another's flames. It was about identifying the invisible net of care that held medieval travel together. Not compassion in the manner you consider of it, but structured mercy, conditional generosity, ritualized humanity. From the salt container on the host surface to the ladle on a peg, from the chalk mark on a shutter to the whispered regulation at a roadside shrine, every one of these actions had weight, significance, a gamble for the provider, an obligation for the receiver. And they maintained individuals alive, not merely nourished and accommodated, but acknowledged in a realm without maps, without identifications, without security nets. These were the principles that created you comprehend. You rotate on your side, nestle deeper into the straw, and attend to the gentle pattern of rest descending on the space, one breath at a time, one rustle of linen, one sigh from the woman near the fireplace. The hall protests. The flames arranges, and somewhere distant down the route you understand someone else will arrive tomorrow, hungry, frigid, uncertain, and they'll witness the marks. They'll knock on the entrance and someone will respond, not because they understand them, but because the principles still hold. Even currently, you're still there, tucked into the straw, but the flames merely embers currently. The voices are absent. Even the dog at your feet is still, and you sense it, don't you? The quiet hush of a realm that somehow held itself together with nothing but shaped beams, fractured bread and distributed material. Rest. You weren't royalty. You weren't wealthy. You weren't even recognized. But still, someone preserved you a location. That's the lesson you assume with you as you drift. In the medieval realm, hospitality wasn't soft, it wasn't sentimental, it was principles, ceremonies, boundaries, and through those principles, a peculiar, dependable heat. The variety of heat that communicated you belong here if only for the darkness. So as your own space drops silent and the illuminations outside your window blur, consider of the lengthy route behind you. Consider of the chalk marks, the organised fabric, the ladle created hanging, and understand this. Even when the realm sensed wild, individuals constructed trails through it. Even when confidence was risky, someone always welcomed an entrance. And even in the darkest stretch of the journey, you were never fully solitary. Rest thoroughly, wanderer. You've pursued the indicators. You've created your mark, your dwelling currently.